Good afternoon. It's for me a great pleasure to introduce this conversation between the Boston Consulting Group and the EsadeGeo. Uh, Boston Consulting Group is one of the most important firms in consulting, and EsadeGeo is, as you know, is part of geopolitics and geoeconomics of ESADE. The topic of debate or topic of discussion is a document that has been presented by Boston Consulting Group in cooperation with ESADE on a very fundamental topic of today, which is the trade relationship between China and the United States. As everybody knows, one of the most difficult things we have on the international arena today is how to resolve the problems, the tensions between China and the United States, in particular on trade and in particular on the trade related to technology. I would like to say a couple of words about the debate, just to place in the context of the situation of today this very important problem that I just mentioned. Today we have very important news that coming from the other side of the Pacific, from the United States. We have already the possibility closer to have president-elect to be the next president of the United States. And we have also the nomination of three very important topics, personalities: the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and the National Security Advisor from President Biden. I like to say very clearly that I am very, very, very happy not only to see President Biden as President of the United States, but also to see what type of people he is choosing to be the leaders of the foreign affairs and trade relationship of this team. They are very good people. I know them all. Young people with tremendous energy, very intelligent people, and I am sure that we're going to see things moving on and moving on rapidly on topics as the one that we're going to debate today: China, United States, and relation with technology. Uh, I would like to say that the possibility of finding a solution in the short period of time on the China United States trade is not going to happen in hours or in days. But it's very important to have a clear attitude from the United States vis-a-vis China. And I think that that attitude is going to be exposed very clearly by the new team and in a rather short period of time. And therefore, things may begin to, as I said before, to move on and a topic which is fundamental. So the debate of today enters into one of the most important topics that have to be discussed in order to have in the global economy the possibility of diminishing the problems related to trade, and in particular the elements of trade which are related to technology. The second thing I would like to say is that we have a good opportunity also, not only because we have already the United States election more or less resolved, but because we have also the needs of fill the position of general director of the WTO. The WTO is going to continue to be one of the most important organizations on the global arena, and to have a new director of the WTO is fundamental. And it has taken a long time because President Trump didn't want to agree with the global consensus on the person that was supposed to be the new Director General of WTO. So that is going to be resolved because President Biden will join the global consensus, and so we will have a Director General of the WTO rapidly. So, what that I want to say that the discussion of today takes place in a background which is very different than the background that we had a month ago. Today we have a background in which the President of the United States is going to be John Biden. We know it. The team that is going to be leading these problems are already appointed. And on the other hand, we have the possibility of having the WTO with the new general director and therefore ready to also to move on. So it couldn't be a better moment to have this conversation. I want to thank once again to Boston Consulting Group and to Esade. And with that, I let you talk. I let you start the conversation.
Hello. Let me introduce this great event that we have here that we are hosting here at the EsadeGeo, Esade Business School. I'm Angel Saz-Carranza, professor of strategy and public policy and director of our center, Esade's Center on Geopolitics and Business. We have a great event with two of the most globally experienced and expert speakers on the topic, a topic which is at the core of EsadeGeo's interests, which clearly bring together international business and economics and geopolitics. Today's topic is about clearly going into the technology trade war between the US and China. Our two experts speakers are from Boston Consulting Group, both of them, and it's delightful to have them with us. Antonio Varas from Palo Alto, or speaking from Palo Alto, is the managing director and senior partner at Boston Consulting Group. He is the global practice leader of semiconductors at the firm, and therefore covers this topic, or has been covering this topic of the technological trade war for quite a few months and years now. Our second speaker, or his colleague, is Michael McAdoo, partner and director at Boston Consulting Group, Montreal. He is a principal at BCG and an expert in the intertwined topics of international business strategy, public policy, and geopolitics. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and looking forward to the presentation. And following that presentation, we will have Q&A with the audience. Michael, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Angel. Nice to see everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We'd like to cover basically some topics with you today related to the US-China trade war. We'll take it in 4 sections. We go to the next slide, please. The first one is around just the changing global dynamics. What is actually driving this issue? Is it driven by one president or the other, or are there some longer-term dynamics taking place here? Secondly, what is the full range of the US-China frictions? It's not limited to the trade war, but some other topics as well. We'll then get into the risk of decoupling. Antonio will take us through different elements of the technology that is in question here. And finally, for those business participants, how do we find companies reacting to this, and how should they react to the new normal? So if we go to the next page, please, I want to just land a point with you that this is not something that has been normal these last 200 years. If you go back to the year 1, and I apologize for the historical bias in choosing the year 1, this is world GDP by major geographies. And you can see that in the year 1, almost 3/4 of world GDP was found in Asia. And that's because basically Asia had the most population, and all parts of the world had similar levels of technology and education. It stayed pretty similar until the European Renaissance, when Europe starts to get ahead technologically, starts to get ahead in terms of education. And that growth of European GDP continues, if we click forward, for the next several hundred years. And by the time we get to 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that's when Europe really is very, very dominant in total global GDP. Now, you'll notice the United States has just appeared as a small blue line at the top of this. And of course, 1815 is when we transitioned from France as a dominant power in Europe to the United Kingdom as it built out its major colonial empire. Moving forward to the next 100 years, at the end of World War I, you can see in a short period of 100 years, there's the United States as a major contributor to world GDP. And clicking forward, this is the world we grew up with in most of the 20th century, with Europe and United States really dominating global GDP. Then something happens in 1990. the world starts to open up. Soviet Union falls, China starts to open up under Deng Xiaoping, and we get to the point that by today, 2019, we now see how much Asia has risen in the past 20 to 30 years, now back up to about half of global GDP. And then progressing forward, if you just assume some higher growth rates in Asia, slower growth rates in North America, Europe, and sort of a middling growth rate in rest of world, by the year 2050, we're back where we were in the year one. So this past period of 200 years is really not normal. And so it really doesn't matter who's sitting in the White House or who's sitting in the Forbidden City. This dynamic of the rise of China is something that's quite fundamental in the global economy. Next page, please. And if you look at the impact on trade, you can see China joining WTO. Just look at the slope of the trade growth, the green line versus GDP growth. And you've really seen since the financial crisis that green line much more flat. Geopolitical risk has been growing. It wasn't just a Trump phenomenon, growing also during the period of Obama. Next, please. And when you look at the US-China conflict, and I apologize for this, I'm from Canada, we like icebergs here. The trade deficit really is just the tip of the iceberg. It's where there's been a lot of sunlight, a lot of conversation, particularly in the last number of years. But fundamentally, there are other trade issues, security concerns, and strategic competition between superpowers driven by the point I made on the previous page. And when you look at the support for this is very important, and Secretary Solana made this comment when he spoke earlier. This is not a question of just the Trump administration. There is really, quite a broad set of concerns around the U.S. administration on the rise of China, how to deal with it. And I think we will see some differences in the new administration going forward, but the fundamental issues will remain. And Tony, I'll bring you in to give some comment on this page, please.
Yeah, just one thing to emphasize is that in addition to the well-known trade issues, both deficit and questions about China's alleged infringement on market rules and IP protection, forced technology transfer, or state subsidies, there's two underlying issues that are very hard to solve. One is the expanding notion of what is cybersecurity, what is security. So clearly the center of this over the last few years has been the concern on the US about Huawei's increasing global share in network infrastructure and their leadership in 5G. But also, if you look at what has been happening in the last 12 months, is that concern that was in network infrastructure now has expanded to almost every single digital device or digital service that has a wide install base. So think about the underlying dynamics that led to considering TikTok a potential cybersecurity risk for the US. If you think about it, with millions of connected devices, those are potentially devices that can be hacked and can be weaponized to instrument a denial of service attack on the network of any country. And then the last thing there is also the increasing realization that technology is itself a core element of any defense or weapon mechanism. So more and more technologies are seen as having dual use, military, civil, and therefore our technology advantage is something that a superpower wants to protect. And the last dimension, the number 4, is, as Michael was saying, we're in a moment of transition where we're seeing the emergence of another superpower. So certainly the U.S., after the policy of the last few decades, I think there's now the conviction that China is not changing. The Communist Party is tightening the rules. China is rising as an assertive challenger in the international arena. And also that China is becoming a technology global power with leadership in areas like 5G, AI, and trying to build a semiconductor industry. And those are all cause of concerns for the US. Michael, back to you.
Thanks, Antonio. So we'll go to the next page, please. I think there was a belief even earlier in this year that somehow President Trump would have a deal with China and everything would go back to normal. I even heard some senior executives saying that earlier in 2020 before we had the COVID crisis. But in the last kind of 9 to 10 months, we've seen really some significant issues that have not made this easier. Of course, the pandemic itself and certain perceptions on how China managed that and its level of transparency. Obviously, the new Hong Kong security law. We have obviously the way China has been portrayed in the recent US campaign and the ongoing stalemate over Huawei and technology, where there just doesn't seem to be a path forward. So the ambiance is a little bit different than it even was a year ago, and I would argue more challenging. If you go to the next page, you know, we're obviously in a moment of transition, but as I mentioned before, there is this broad consensus on the US side that China needs to be dealt with. I think there'll be a very big difference in perhaps the tone, some of the mechanisms. And as Secretary Solana was saying, I think some of these nominations we've seen in the last 24 to 48 hours show some very senior people. But these people are you know, well versed in all the things that have been tried in the past by the US government, all the things that have been tried presently. And so I think you may see a different set of tools being used, but I would not say that we'll go back to the prior status quo. Obviously, China itself is expanding its relations in the world. You will notice that about 10 days ago, a major new free trade agreement was signed called the RCEP. This covers about 1/3 of GDP of the world, and China is very much at the center of that, although not the only drivers. So I think we're seeing really the pieces being put on the chessboard for continued conflict in the space. But I do think that the way the conflict is managed will be different. Thanks. So over to you, Antonio, for what this means now.
So the question is, where do we go from here? So first, there's significant uncertainty still in the outlook. So we have tried to lay out here is a potential path. So we are right now in the middle of this double entry matrix that has the two axes of conflict, the trade or economic frictions and the geopolitical frictions. So one potential scenario is that the current status quo, where we have tariffs on all industrial and most consumer goods remain. And also we continue to see from the US a broad technology export ban, not just on Huawei, but also on other Chinese technology entities. In the best case scenario, we move to some easing of the conflict. So we could envision, perhaps, given the counterproductive effects of the tariffs even on the US economy, is the move by the new Biden administration to settle some of the trade issues and China's economic issues in the form of a phase 2 trade deal that rolls back most of the tariffs. So we could see moving from 1 to 2. Best case scenario, we could also see that leading to a settlement on the question of Huawei that needs to find a solution. Huawei simply, after the last set of restrictions, can not continue doing business forever without access to technology. So we do believe that there is a possibility of having the Huawei conflict settled between the US and China at some point during the next year. But even in that best case scenario, those two underlying issues that we describe in the iceberg metaphor, the cybersecurity concerns and the strategic competition, will continue. We do not foresee an easy or fast resolution of those elements of the conflict. So a key message is, don't expect a return to the pre-2016 status quo. Even with the Biden administration, the underlying objective of US policy will remain in substance the same, even if in the forms, particularly when it comes to involvement of allies and embracement of multilateral institutions, the new administration might set a very different tone. But of course, an increasing number of scholars and even policymakers are starting to think or talk openly about a different path, a path that continues the trajectory that we have seen in the last 12, 18 months of continuous escalation, leading to the so-called decoupling also described sometimes in terms of a new Cold War. And that Cold War or decoupling might happen with unilateral U.S. action, or might happen perhaps in a Biden or with the U.S. building a wider coalition. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about what is decoupling, what would that mean, and is that even a potential scenario? The first thing to notice is who wants decoupling. Certainly, U.S. firms don't want decoupling. So what we've done is we've modeled what would be the impact on firms in the U.S. and China if the economic flows between the two countries were to shut down completely. And the impact, broadly speaking, can be described as two areas. First one is market access. So clearly there's a lot of multinationals, US companies amongst them, that sell their products and services in China. So we have quantified there's about $400 billion of revenue that US firms make in the China domestic market. That's roughly 5% of the total revenues of corporate America. That is 3-4 times bigger than the similar exposure of Chinese firms to the US domestic market. So it's about 140 billion of Chinese revenues coming from products and services sold to US consumers or end users. That's about 1% of the total corporate China revenues. So US firms much more exposed to China domestic market. And there's a similar picture emerging when you look at the supply chain. So we have analyzed the supply chains across industries and found that for the US, there's 16 entire industries that are very largely dependent on China because they have most of the manufacturing in China, or because they rely on components or inputs such as rare earths and metals like lithium, germanium, tungsten, where China is the world leader. And in fact, most of those industries will have a hard time replacing China as a supplier in the medium term. Simply, there's no other country or set of countries immediately available to switch or shift the supply chains in the next 3 to 5 years. It will take time. For China, there's only 3 industries that are in that situation, and 2 of them happen to be the tech-related, the consumer and enterprise technology. So if you compute these numbers, 5% of the revenue might sound like a small number, but that would translate at the current valuation multiples of the stock market to about 2.5 trillion in market value, market capitalization of US firms that would disappear if the US firms were not able to continue doing business in China. So clearly, corporate America, US businesses do not want decoupling. The second thing to understand is does China want to decouple from the US? Well, for China, they're building an economy that is increasingly less reliant on trade, on exports. They have also found new trade partners that can replace the US in the last couple of years since the Trump administration started enacting the tariffs. So for China, the key element of dependence in the US is technology. So what we show in this page is the comparison across the layers of the technology stack of market shares by country of origin of the supplier. And what, without getting into too much detail, I think what is interesting to note is that if you look at the China technology stack, you start seeing a lot of red in the upper layers of this stack. And those are the applications, the cloud platforms, the devices, both for the end user, like mobile phones, PCs, but also on the enterprise, servers or network infrastructure. So China has been actively, de facto, pursuing a decoupling from the rest of the world. They have been promoting their internal domestic vendors to provide to the Chinese economy the technology they need in all these upper layers of the stack. Now, what is not happened yet is that China has not been successful yet in building their own technology and supplier ecosystem for the bottom part of the technology stack, the operating system for any kind of devices, and the semiconductors. So what you see there is China is still today relies on global foundational technologies and standards, primarily US based. Those are the blue bars that you see at the bottom. So the dynamic here is China has been pursuing this decoupling for years as a national security imperative. And the cybersecurity law in China or the autonomous controllable policy of China are pointing at acceleration of that trend. But where China is struggling to decouple from the US is in operating systems and semiconductors. Those are the priorities for development of alternative suppliers by China, but also the choke points that the US is trying to leverage with export controls to put pressure on China or slow down the development of the technology industry in China. In fact, we believe that semiconductors is at the core of this conflict. Semiconductors, you can think of it as the new battlefield where this threat technology war is being played between US and China. Unless you really know the technology industry, the recent events might have been overlooked. So what has happened is that the US has been setting a set of export controls on Huawei over the last 18 months. And in the process of doing that, the US has created a policy tool that sometimes are described as a nuclear weapon to potentially disrupt the entire Chinese technology sector. So let me explain what it is so that you understand why this is so fundamental in the evolution of the conflict. So what the US did back in May 2019 is they effectively passed regulation to block exports of the semiconductors that Huawei, in this case, needed to make their products, but only from US vendors. So effectively, those restrictions only impacted mostly US companies. So those are companies that you see below where the US technology embedded in the product was the majority of the product. So over 50% of the content was US technology. So that was within the sort of standard practice in export controls. Now, that happened in May 2019. Fast forward 1 year, the US realized, well, that is not really disrupting Huawei. Huawei continues doing business because they now source the components that they need, not from US companies, but from their own semiconductor division or from other companies. So what the US did 12 months later in May this year is, and then they expanded in August this year, is to say, well, guess what? If Huawei or the Chinese, they are buying these semiconductors that they need to make the electronic products from companies that are not US companies, I'm going to go and set the export controls based on the upper layers of the value chain. So I'm going to use the fact that US firms have pretty much the entire market, have no alternative competitors in the design tools and in the manufacturing of semiconductors, the equipment in semiconductors, where all that technology is coming from US firms. There's no alternative to US technology. And I'm going to set the restrictions so that if you use any design tool or any manufacturing equipment that uses US technology, you're not able to sell that component that was created with the tools to Huawei. So effectively, the US has found a way to block Huawei in this case, but it's extensible to any Chinese technology company from sourcing the semiconductors, the components that power any kind of device. So right now, irrespective of who makes the device, it could be a European company, but that company is going to have to use these US design tools. And that semiconductor most likely will be made by a Taiwanese foundry that will use US manufacturing equipment. So effectively, US can restrict the supply to China of any integrated circuits. So imagine a scenario where the US decides to block the Chinese technology sector, they can do that. They simply question of adding company names to the entity list. So this is what I call the nuclear weapon that the US has developed in the last 12 to 18 months to effectively block China technology industry from access to the supply chain. So what this means is that we might be on a path towards decoupling, even if that is not the intended policy objective by China or the US. It might simply happen. So there's two versions of how this might happen. One is if you go to the ancient wisdom of the Greek historian Thucydides, as he coined the concept of the Thucydides trap. So if both sides of the confrontation think that a conflict is inevitable, that might actually trigger the conflict. And that is very much the type of thinking that is starting to emerge on both countries, that given these dynamics, is they are on a collision course. But the other one is simply companies might lead to decoupling. Global companies that are starting to understand this sort of exposure I just described are looking at decoupling as perhaps a low probability or a certain scenario, but if it happens, it will be very disruptive. So what global companies are starting to do, good business practice, is take proactive actions to mitigate risk. So they're taking proactive steps to reduce exposure to each other's end market and diversify or substitute the supplier base. So in a way, companies are voting with their feet. US companies are starting to see how they reduce their exposure to China, how they move portions of the supply chain away from China. Chinese companies are starting to look at how they replace US technology with domestic or third-party technology. So in a way, companies, by acting following common business sense, are actually driving a de facto decoupling between the two economies. But irrespective of what the scenario emerges, we're seeing that the genie is already out of the bottle. So there are some trends that in our discussions with clients in both countries and also in other regions, we're starting to observe. The first one is with US tariffs or not. So even if the tariffs were going to be dropped by the Biden administration, the global technology companies are already proactively shifting portions of the supply chain away from China. And as I said, it's simply a prudent measure to increase their resiliency. The second one is with the US export controls or not, with Huawei ban or not, with US entity list or not, the Chinese manufacturers of electronic devices are already proactively looking to reduce dependency on US technology. So they are replacing their US suppliers with third-party suppliers. So we're seeing US technology companies being excluded from bids in certain sectors. We're seeing Chinese manufacturers of smartphone devices or enterprise technology devices leaving out US suppliers are using other good enough suppliers. Whether that falls under the China industrial policy, the Made in China 2025 or not, it doesn't matter. That push by China to become self-sufficient and reduce the risk of being disrupted by US export controls on technology, if anything, this is reaffirming China the need to expand and accelerate and those industrial policies to promote the development of their own domestic sectors. So in a way, you can think of this, if the US, one of the US complaints was China is investing in develop or subsidizing the development of their own technology sector. If anything, these events are pushing China precisely more and more to dig deeper in that direction. So in a way, they're being counterproductive. The third one we're seeing is that end users, consumer enterprises are already aware of these dynamics and are looking to reduce their reliance on what they perceive as a highly exposed suppliers. So no matter if you believe that Huawei is a security risk or not, if you now understand that they can be disrupted by the US as they are being disrupted, you probably want to think twice whether Huawei is a long-term viable supplier. Or the same thing is if you are a US tech company selling your devices in China, Chinese customers with government mandates or not are starting to think, well, these suppliers might be shut down from China tomorrow. Do I want to build my IT infrastructure using them, or shall I use a vendor who might from another country that might not be excluded by political interference? And the last point is this is really an ongoing conflict about technology leadership. So those companies that are in the cutting edge of technology, that have intellectual property in strategic technologies, they're no longer playing in an open market. They are playing in a political battleground. They are at the center of the conflict. So companies in the semiconductor industry, companies in the data center, companies in artificial intelligence, companies in 5G, they are no longer operating in the global market. They are operating, they are becoming weaponized in a way in this conflict. And then the last consideration on where this is going is we expect to see that those national security concerns that drive mutual bans of suppliers and export controls, they're pushing the world more and more into a direction of increasing bifurcation of the technology standards. So if you think about the internet and the technology ecosystem that the internet created, it was supposed to be a global ecosystem where you have a global network and, that was built on global standards and allow companies to develop technology on those standards that could be sold across market. That was of the vision of the tech globalization that was the paradigm in the year 2000. Now, the reality is that we're no longer there. We're already in what some people call the splinternet or the two internets. So there's an internet where some in China, some local players play, and US players don't play. So you have the Facebook, Googles, Amazons have their Chinese version in the Baidu, Alibaba, or Tencent. So you're starting to see that a splinter internet. But where this is going, if each U.S. companies don't have access to Chinese market, Chinese companies don't have access to the U.S. market, and they cannot rely on technology from each other. This is moving not just from a bifurcation of the internet service providers. We're starting to see how standards are being forked. So we're starting to see how China is developing its own version of Android. China is developing its own server architecture, its own PC chip architecture. Even China is proposing a new IP. So we're seeing more and more the world evolving towards a scenario of having two set of global technology standards and stacks aligned by block, where as technology supplier, you have to align yourself with one of those blocks. So this is definitely a threat to the immense value creation that the technology and innovation that the technology industry has delivered. It was based on a set of global standards that will go away if the world becomes of technology becomes bifurcated and we have two separated stacks with segregated suppliers. One final thing before we turn to question. So in this context, what should companies be doing? So we have created here some recommendations of what companies, particularly those who are more exposed to technology, should be doing to adapt to this new normal in the US and China relationships. The first one might sound obvious, but we see most companies actually not doing that, is engage to shape policy, in this case, EU policy. This is not just about US or Chinese companies. The European companies are also being impacted. They are also impacted by US export controls because they use US technology. They're also potentially impacted by China's policies to promote their domestic suppliers. The second one is trade regulation is complex and it's not black and white. You need to develop a really deep understanding of what is possible or allowed or not. So even the export controls on Huawei are not on 100%. There's products that can be exported, products that cannot. So you need to be able to have that deep understanding and also explore what alternative business models that allow you to comply with regulation and maintain most of the business. The third one is clearly rethink the China strategy. So with this and the changes in China's policy towards certain sectors that are very sensitive, are very exposed to technology, the ability to access the China market is changing. There's also opportunities because some of those US players that today are starting to be labeled as unreliable, and China is looking for alternatives. So European companies might well be an alternative to US vendors for Chinese customers, at least in the near medium term. That's related to the next point. We think that there's going to be a huge opportunity as the US tries to reduce exposure or dependency on China and vice versa. So we think we're going to see a massive wave of vendor substitution across all industries on both sides. So this opens opportunities for companies from countries that are not aligned with either bloc. So there's an opportunity to take market share massively because that market share will shift hands in the next 3 to 5 years. Then there's a need to transform the supply chain. It's going to be increasingly complex, more fragmented, more subject to the need to provide transparency because there'll be more and more obstacles to global trade. As I mentioned, intellectual property is becoming a weapon. So it will be subject to pressure. So certainly this is the time to upgrade cybersecurity policies or rethink about how much technology you share, especially if you do business in China. And lastly is emerging technologies that did not look viable because they were too immature 1 or 2 years ago, might actually become the emerging standards. So as China pushes to develop alternatives to the existing foundational technologies that are relying on US, China is big enough, will pull enough resources to make some of those niche alternatives or mature alternatives of today viable mass adoption technologies in the very near future. So for those kind of technology, China is pushing a new IP protocol. China is pushing new architectures in processors that go into servers, PCs, or smartphones. Those did not look viable 12 months ago. Those could become viable if this is the architecture that China adopted in the next 2-3 years. So definitely another opportunity for disruption in the market. So that's what we wanted to share. I think we got more or less on time. So I'm going to give it back to Oscar to moderate any questions that might have come during the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. Very, very interesting indeed. Perhaps to start off, a couple of questions, one for each of you. The report and your presentation seems to give an idea of certain deterministic future. So the revival of China and eventually a decoupling. First, do you see any possibility, Michael, for China not recovering fully its weight as it had decades ago? And I know this is a futuristic question, but is there a possibility of something happening in China, given your knowledge of that country, and that might not accomplish that return or re-emergence? And for Antonio, how far back do you think, or what's the delay in time for Chinese companies to be able to catch up? So what is the time horizon you think that a company like Huawei or the next Huawei will be able to be at the level of the United States firms, in particular in terms of semiconductors?
Well, I'll take the first question first. I mean, listen, there's a famous quote that is attributed to Napoleon, who says, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will rock the world. And, so I think we can debate sort of the speed of that, I'll call it recovery to a traditional place of importance in GDP. But I don't think that the outcome is avoidable or can be ultimately, made not to happen. I think the variable that is important, and this is something that has changed in China, particularly in the last decade or so, is just what kind of China comes into the world. And those of us with longer memories, I can remember going to China. I worked for the Canadian Prime Minister. In 1994, we visited China, and we had Jiang Zemin and Li Peng and these people. And the idea was, if you engage with China, it will become more modern, it will strengthen its institutions, it might even have some kind of market economy someday. We may see some kind of political openness. China will engage in the world, with the world on the basis of the Bretton Woods systems, institutions, norms of behavior, these kinds of things. This was a very widely held view. And I think, through my time as an executive, visiting China many times, I was in the aerospace industry, engaging with Chinese companies. And I think there was a lot of optimism around that vector when China joined the WTO. I always tell people, everyone remembers September 11th, 2001, but December 11th is when China joined WTO. People thought, this is great, here comes China in the world system. But if you look at how China has evolved domestically and particularly internationally in the last few years, it's a very different China than we imagined. And it's a very different mode to what we've seen other countries adopt when they gain a place in the world. I mean, you can look at the rise of Japan in the 70s and 80s. Never going to be as big as China will become, but still in the 80s, this was a big deal. But Japan engaged with the world in those kind of norms, right? And we have situations now, if you just look at Chinese relations with a country like Canada, where we had an obligation under an international treaty to engage in an extradition process for a certain executive, and the next thing you know, we have 2 Canadians held for nearly 2 years now in China. Or if you look at what's happening with Australia today, if you look at the number of comments that Chinese leaders are making, it's very unprecedented and very much outside the norm. That may change. I can't forecast what domestic things may happen in China, but the world is not accustomed to people dealing in that manner. There's a way things have been done for the last 75 years in the world, and China certainly is a part of that. I don't want to say they're not. They've in many ways been a good WTO member, and they've lost some cases, and they've made changes, and they have done opening, but there's still this other dimension there. So I think that's more open question in my mind, is not so much the size of China, maybe the speed to get there, and then what kind of China are we dealing with, and how does the rest of the world, I would argue, encourage China to continue to engage with the global system and consider it fair for its interests.
Okay, great.
And really quick, the second question on time horizon to China's technology independence of self-sufficiency. China has been trying to do this already for decades in semiconductors, and it's hard, limited progress so far. It's not a question of money; it's a question to access to technology. So even today, after already a decade of pouring money, China is only able to design something like 5-7% of the semiconductors they consume. And if you look at manufacturing, a similar percentage. And the problem here to understand is that your supply chain is as strong as your weakest link in that supply chain. So you might get all the components you need, but if you need an advanced processor that goes into a smartphone or a server or data center to be able to do AI, you're gonna need the most advanced manufacturing, and that there's only 3 companies in the world that can do that. One is Samsung in Korea, one is Taiwan, and then it's Intel, and they all use US technology. So how quickly can China develop indigenous alternative for that? It could take a decade or decades. That's why China was relying on using Taiwan, European, Korean suppliers while they were building their own domestic industry. And that's why the geostrategic importance of Taiwan now is even bigger. It's no longer just about the territorial claims of China. It's also about the role that Taiwan plays in advanced semiconductor design and manufacturing that is essential for the continuous progress of China technology industry.
All right. Vamos a tomar un par de últimas preguntas en castellano para ampliar un poco el espectro y creo que hay un par de preguntas que vienen de personas de habla castellana y sé que Michael, Antonio es de esta parte del mundo y Michael es un experto en la lengua castellana. ¿Qué tiene y puede hacer Europa en este conflicto? ¿Cuál es, según vosotros, no tanto la empresa europea, que creo que ha quedado claro lo que debe hacer, pero en este pelea de estos titanes, ¿qué puede hacer Europa? Y quizá pueda aprender también de Canadá, del ejemplo de Canadá o de otros.
Antonio, como europeo.
Yo, en primer lugar, Europa puede y debe jugar un papel moderador en el conflicto. No es moderador en el sentido de que lo que hemos visto en los últimos 2 años en Estados Unidos es un montón de acción unilateral, muy agresiva y muy amplia. Todos los problemas se enfocaban desde el punto de vista de todo o nada. Confrontación ideológica. El papel de Europa es reforzar las tendencias multilateralistas y pragmáticas de Estados Unidos, es ser un socio colaborador que ayude a poner presión sobre China en ciertos puntos de la agenda donde los intereses y los valores de Europa son compartidos con Estados Unidos y evite que Estados Unidos tenga la tendencia de volver a técnicas o políticas unilateralistas y enormemente agresivas y disruptivas. En ese sentido, yo creo que el papel de Europa es fundamental, sobre todo en los próximos 2 años, para ayudar al equipo de Biden a hacer esa transición en el modo de afrontar el problema.
Sí, excelente respuesta. Yo creo poner un punto más, es que en Europa siempre es un reto tener una alianza, una frente común hacia estos problemas. La Comisión es una cosa, pero también hay Estados miembros y a veces ellos tienen diferentes intereses. Entonces, lo más importante dentro de Europa es llegar a un punto de vista común y, como dice Antonio, puede ser una fuerza para el bueno, ¿no? Las reglas, las normas, el sistema multilateral, etc.
Okay. Another question coming in from, I think, an English-speaking audience. How do you expect the 5G network infrastructure to be in 10 years' time? Or who will be the main providers of that infrastructure?
Well, I'll distinguish 2 things. From providers on infrastructure, the U.S. concern about Huawei is not just is Huawei going to go and tamper the infrastructure. The U.S. concern is what the trajectory that Huawei is taking makes the U.S. believe that in 5 to 10 years, Huawei's market share might make it the only viable solution for advanced infrastructure. So the problem is, what if you want to do 6G, you have no choice but to use Chinese technology, because Huawei has already achieved 50-60% share. Nokia and Ericsson are pretty much irrelevant, more than falling behind, and there's no another one. So from that standpoint, it's clear that for the US, there's only one outcome of the whole dispute with Huawei, that is, Huawei needs to be contained. So it's structurally. So it's not getting out of this network or that network. Is Huawei cannot be let free to lead the world in the evolution of 5G towards 6G. So you need to create a market structure that ensures that Nokia, Ericsson, other suppliers are viable alternatives to Huawei. So from that standpoint, I would expect that we're going to see, perhaps with a transition to new technology paradigms like Open RAN, alternatives to Huawei, we're going to see a much more balanced or a structure where you might have, obviously, Huawei leading, Ericsson, Nokia leading, but a more diverse set of potential suppliers, particularly as we transition to a different technology paradigm. In terms of which can, the risk here is that, given that China or the US decides to create their own set of standards, so we move from a single global standard in 5G to the world we had prior to 4G, where China has its flavor, the US might have its flavor, and they are mutually not interoperable. That's the risk that so breaks the paradigm of global standards that has fostered innovation in the last decade or so.
All right. A last question from Ignacio Palau. Perhaps you can go back to Spanish. El bifurcated, el sistema de bifurcación, ¿generará dos ganadores o un ganador y un perdedor?
Yo creo, honestamente, bueno, perdedores, en primer lugar, todos somos perdedores, porque desde el punto de vista de usuarios no se puede replicar el avance de innovación que hemos tenido sin la escala global y el acceso a innovación global. Entonces, en primer lugar, perdedores es el mundo. Yo creo que los dos bloques bifurcados son económicamente viables. Hicimos modelos y simplemente si pones en un lado los países que son tradicionalmente aliados económicos de Estados Unidos y cuentas población, GDP, consumo de tecnología, y pones al otro lado los que se podrían alinear con China, de hecho, el mundo son dos partes, incluso la parte de China es un poquito incluso más grande. Y después puedes poner terceros países que decidan no alinearse, aunque tendrán que optar por una u otra tecnología. Así que el mundo puede ser perfectamente bipolar. No es una situación como la que teníamos a lo mejor en el Cold War, donde teníamos un polo que era económicamente inviable. En este caso, los polos son económicamente viables. Y de nuevo, piensa en cosas como, no es solamente el control de la información, es cosas como los estándares para utilizar inteligencia artificial. China tiene una versión mucho más relajada. Se puede utilizar datos, la privacidad no es tan importante. Al final, la inteligencia artificial necesita acceso a datos. Es muy posible que China consiga tener liderazgo en, por ejemplo, terapias avanzadas, si puede experimentar con más datos de pacientes. En esa situación, incluso para Europa, es ¿qué prefieres? ¿Prefieres el modelo chino o vas a decir no quiero estas terapias avanzadas porque se desarrollaron con un tipo de modelo de privacidad que no es el de mis valores? Entonces, es muy factible que veamos un mundo muy bipolar con dos stacks de tecnología que son viables. Y simplemente la decisión de uno u otro puede ser o pragmática o basada en valores.
Muy bien. Pues Antonio y Michael, muchísimas gracias por vuestro tiempo. Thank you very much for participating in this event. I truly recommend the report, and I hope we can continue talking about these geopolitical and trade topics in the coming future. Thank you very much.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias a todos. Thank you. Always a pleasure.